Hi everyone, welcome to week 10. So this week we're leaving Plato behind and we're reading an article by Hannah Arendt, who is probably the most famous political philosopher of the 20th century. Like Jason Stanley, who we read before we read Plato, Hannah Arendt also makes a lot of references to the ancient Greeks. And in this article, the differences between how the ancients thought about things like truth and politics versus how the modern experience of those things are is very, very important. So that's why I specifically moved Hannah Arendt from week 6 to week 10 so that we could read her after we read Plato's dialogue. Gorgeous. So before I introduce you, this article, it's not easy. This is why this video may be a little bit longer than others. It's a difficult article, even though it's only 20 pages. Don't give up and don't get discouraged. I'm going to walk you through it bit by bit. The article is divided into 5 sections. This video will cover only sections 1 through 3. Okay? Before I start into the article, let me give you a little bit of background on Hannah Arendt and who she was. So Hannah Arendt was born to a Jewish family in Germany in 1906. So she was a young woman by the time the Nazis came to power. I think she had completed her graduate studies, but she was still maybe early in her career as an academic. She escaped the Nazis not once but twice. The first time she was arrested in Germany for researching anti-Semitism. She escaped then and fled, I think, first to Czechoslovakia, then she went to France. But France, as we know now, didn't turn out to be a safe place to be either, so she was arrested there as well. When she escapes the second time, she goes to New York City, like many refugees do, and she joins up with a whole cadre of Jewish intellectuals who had escaped the Nazis. And there are some very famous people who fall into that cadre. Not only former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was part of that, but also Leo Strauss, another famous philosopher of the 20th century, and Hans Morgenthau, the person who's known kind of as the grandfather of the field of international relations. And that's not even all. That's just all I have in my head at the moment. There are many brilliant minds that, fortunately, by the grace of God, escaped the Nazis, managed to survive the Holocaust, and wind up over here in the United States, where we get to take advantage of that trove of wealth of information that they brought along with them and developed here. So Hannah Arendt was one of that group. She became most famous first for her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which was published in 1951, pretty much just after the war ended. But then another thing happened that I'm going to tell you about that lays the groundwork for why she wrote this article that we're reading in this class. In 1961, the Israeli Special Forces, the Mossad, went into Argentina to extract a Nazi war criminal by the name of Adolf Eichmann. As you may know, many Nazi war criminals fled Germany and Europe after the war and wound up in South America and various South American countries. In this case, Eichmann was tracked down by the Special Operations Forces of the State of Israel. They extracted him, brought him back to Israel to stand trial for war crimes in Jerusalem. Now, let me just clarify, because for her this was a significant point. It's an important point of legality. The war crimes did not happen in Jerusalem. They happened in Germany, of course. The trial took place in Jerusalem, and of course he was found guilty and executed. Now, Hannah Arendt's role in this is that she traveled from the U.S. over to Israel to cover this trial for the New Yorker magazine. And she wrote an article about it, and then she published another book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. So that was published in 1963. And that book was somewhat controversial. I'll tell you a little bit about the reasons why it was. And then she wrote this article that we're reading in this class this week in 1967. So in Eichmann in Jerusalem, one of the most controversial things about it is its subtitle. Its subtitle is A Report on the Banality of Evil. So to us, that phrase is very famous today, and it may not seem controversial to us today. but given the context in which she was writing, which is still the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, it was very controversial. A lot of people, especially in Germany, but not just Germany, but a lot of people did not want to think, a lot of people wanted to think that what happened during World War II was extraordinary. It was a once in a lifetime thing. It's unlikely to ever happen again. Adolf Hitler was a monster, and we don't know how he came into power. He got elected, and that's the way they wanted to think about World War II, as something extraordinary, something that was unlikely to happen again. And this made Hannah Arendt very uncomfortable. So she wrote in the portrait of Eichmann that she painted in her article and in the book, she says something to the effect of like, he was not a monster. He was a bureaucrat. He was, and she even says something, she doesn't say he was anti-Semitic, but one of the criticisms was that people thought she was saying that he wasn't anti-Semitic. What she was saying was that his anti-Semitism was not the motivating factor for his actions. It was the way he internalized the illogic, irrationality, what Jason Stanley would call false ideology, of the Nazi regime. Okay, so she said that it wasn't his anti-Semitism that motivated him. It was the way his whole mind had become taken over by the logic or the truth of the totalitarian regime in which he was a part of. So one of the things that she says in that book that kind of illustrates this is that it's shown in the way that he talked, the way he uses language. You can he always spoke in a sort of bureaucratese or legalese, like the language of the bureaucrat. And she said that demonstrated how twisted and mangled his thinking had become, that he could no longer think clearly or think for himself. He could only think as part of the machine. And for Hannah Arendt, she says that's the danger that all humans are susceptible to. Okay? And so what she's trying to do in this article is explain why. She's trying to explain what is the relationship between truth and politics, okay? So how do we get to this idea? Well, and then another thing that was happening at the time that she was also uncomfortable with, and this is where it really may ring true to some of us today, is that people didn't want to accept certain facts. They didn't want to accept the fact that Hitler was elected. He was very popular. He had a lot of popular support in Germany. After the war, all of a sudden, like, all Germans were like, no, they've never supported Hitler, right? And of course, that was not true. So some of these people were lying, perhaps even to themselves, about just how much support Hitler had within Germany. Other uncomfortable truths were that some people and some venerable institutions collaborated with the Nazis. And Arendt says the Nazis would not have been able to been as successful at killing as many people as they did without the help of the people who collaborated with them. So she's very, very, I don't want to say harsh, but she's not going to let anybody off the hook for collaborating with a totalitarian, murderous regime, such as the Nazi regime. And so some people said that she was blaming the victim because some of those collaborators were Jewish themselves, right? And some of them were living in France. One of the biggest collaborators was the Vatican, the Catholic Church, turned a blind eye to what was happening in Germany. And for all of these people, for all of these actors, Hannah Arendt is not going to let them off the hook and just say that they were blinded by the regime. They were blinded by the regime, but she's going to say they're still responsible for their actions. And we are all still responsible ultimately for our actions, even when we're living under a totalitarian regime like that of the Nazis. What she's doing in this article is she's going to take us step by step and show us exactly why she comes to that conclusion, okay? So what she says in the beginning is that even though it seems like, whenever truth and politics clash, that is, whenever, the truth is something that the political powers that be don't want to accept, whenever the two clash, that politics always wins. She says, in reality, in the end, it doesn't. Okay, so truth always remains beyond the realm of the political. So in the next slides, I'm going to walk you through step by step how she comes to that conclusion. And this article, although it is very dense, it is very short, and there's sections of it that you may not understand every detail of it, don't get hung up on those sections where you don't understand. Keep going, get to the end of the article first, listen to this video, this will help, and then go back and read it again. Like I said, you have to read political theory often multiple times before you understand it. I've read this article I don't know how many times, and each time I get something more out of it. I understand it a little bit better, and I make these videos which helps me understand it even more. So don't get discouraged. I'm going to walk you through the rest of her argument in the rest of this video, okay? Okay, so in section 1, like I said, the article is divided into 5 sections. In section 1, you can look at the first paragraph to see a statement of the problem. In that paragraph, she lists a bunch of questions that all boil down to some version of this one. Why does it seem that truth and politics do not mix? Now, notice that she's not asking, what is the nature of truth in this question? She's saying, what is the relationship between truth and politics? What does politics do to truth? Does it accept it wholesale, unquestioningly? No, of course not. When truth threatens the political powers that be, what usually happens? Right? Who usually wins in that case? Hint, it's not the truth, usually, right? It's politics. So that's what she means when she doesn't phrase it this way. I'll phrase it this way because it's a great pun for our own times, that politics trumps truth. That's what she says. So that's sort of the statement of the problem. She says, why does it seem that politics always wins out over truth? So if you look on, and she only says this, the statement of the problem really is only the first paragraph. On page 296 of the article, that's page 2 of the PDF, at the very top, she gives her answer, and she says it will come as somewhat of a surprise. And that's the paragraph where you find her answer, where she basically says that sacrificing the truth for the sake of politics is the worst thing we can do. Okay, that's basically her answer. You're not going to understand it yet, but you will have a sense of what she means by the time you get through the entire article. She starts off right away with saying that this conflict between truth and politics is old and complicated, and she's going to tell us a bit about how it's been thought about in ancient times versus now. Remember I said in the first slide that, political theorists often like to go back to the ancients and contrast how the ancients thought versus how modern political thinkers think. And that's what she does here. She goes back and she talks about Plato, who we just finished reading, so this part will sound familiar, and Hobbes, who we didn't read, but I'll fill you in on that. And she says both Plato and Hobbes was not ancient, by the way, but could be considered, he's right on the cusp of between ancient and modern. He's about in the 1650s. He's writing in the 1650s in the midst of a bunch of civil wars in England. So she says both Plato and Hobbes agreed that the political powers that be, that's my phrase, not hers, but that's a great phrase. I think it's more clear. If you want to substitute that phrase whenever she just says the word politics, that might be helpful. So the political powers that be, whenever they were threatened by the truth, that they were often threatened by the truth, right? Both Plato and Hobbes say that. But what kind of truths did Plato and Hobbes think were most threatening? Well, Plato thought it was philosophical truth. There's this part in the Republic, which we didn't read, where Plato describes, in the famous allegory of the cave, where the philosophers, humanity is chained inside the cave, looking at the reflections on the wall, and the philosophers are the ones who travel up outside of the cave towards the light of the sun, which represents ultimate truth and beauty. And then the idea is that philosophers go back down into the cave and they share this discovered truth with the rest of humanity. But Plato said something to the effect of, if men could lay their hands on such a man as this, they would kill him. And they don't say what, he doesn't say why they would kill him, but that's the part where Plato is most clear about the conflict between truth and politics. He just says that philosophical truths threaten politics, threaten the powers that be, threaten the people in the cave, find philosophical truths threatening, right? And now Hobbes said something very similar, only he had phrased it a little bit differently. He doesn't say philosophical truths, he says rational truths. And he says the only kinds of truth that are not threatening to the powers that be are such truths as oppose no man's profit. In other words, as long as it doesn't affect anybody's political interests or profit, then they would accept such a truth. But as soon as it does, even if it was geometry, then they would suppress such a thing. That's what Hobbes says. So Arendt goes into talking about those two things, but then she says for us, in our own time, it's factual truths that are most threatening. And she says Hobbes's statement seems harmless. So what if a tyrant was able to burn all of the geometry books? Say the tyrant could even wipe everybody's memory of all geometry. That's not so concerning, she says, because humanity could always reinvent geometry, right? We could come up with it again. We can't do that for a factual truth once it has been erased. And that's why these kinds of truths, factual truths, are more vulnerable than rational truths. And as an example of a factual truth being erased, she talks about Trotsky, who was literally written out of the history books by the Stalinist regime in Russia at that time. There was some dispute between the two of them. They were both leaders in the Bolshevik party. They had a falling out. Trotsky ends up having to flee to South America, by the way, where he gets murdered. And Stalin takes over. And they tried to literally write him out of the history books. They tried to erase him out of existence. That's an example of the factual truths being lost. And she says once factual truths are lost, there's no bringing them back. And there's a specific reason why that is. She's going to go into it more later on, but she doesn't say that yet in section 1. Okay, but there is one important sentence. I want you to find this on your pages and underline this, because this is an important thing that will help you understand the rest of the article. And it's where she says something to the effect of dominion, meaning political power, when it attacks rational truth, oversteps its domain, while it gives battle on its own ground when it falsifies or lies away facts. Okay, so dominion, when it attacks rational truths, it's overstepping its own domain. So think about the domain of politics, and then there's this other area outside of that domain. And she says rational truths lie outside of that domain. The ancients, like Socrates and Plato, thought philosophical truths lie out there also. Within the domain, when political power attacks rational truths, it's overstepping its own domain. But when it attacks factual truths, when it lies about facts, then it's giving battle on its own ground within its own domain. Now that's going to become an important analogy to remember when she starts explaining what she means by that in the rest of the article. Okay, so that's why I say underline it. It's towards the end of the first section, on the second page of the PDF, which I think is page 297 of the article. So on the next slide, I'm going to say, and the one more reason why rational truth lies outside of the domain of politics is because if you think about it, a dictator, no matter how powerful they are, they cannot change the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, right? That is a kind of truth. It's a rational truth that they cannot change. So that's what she means by saying rational truth lies outside the domain. And geometry is out there too. Geometry is like a rational truth. It's a mathematical truth. These are truths that lie outside the domain of politics. So no matter how powerful the dictator is, they're never going to be able to change the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, or that geometry exists. If they tried to erase all of those facts, humanity could still reinvent them. Okay, that's what she ends section 1 on. On the next slide, we're going to go into section 2. Okay, now section 2 picks up where section 1 left off, and it says, so the conflict between truth and politics was originally articulated with respect to rational truth, right? That rational truths could conflict with the political powers that be, and that was the conflict as the ancients articulated it, right? That was how the ancients thought about the relationship between truth and politics, is that rational truth could conflict with the political powers that be, and then they would try to suppress such a thing. So then she says that the opposite of a rationally true statement is either error or ignorance. But the opposite of a philosophically true statement is illusion or opinion. Deliberate falsehood, or what she says, the plain lie, is the opposite of fact. Okay? So if a fact is not true, it's a lie. It's not opinion. We say it's opinion now, and people in her time did as well. And she says that's wrong. She doesn't say that here, though, so hold that thought. But she's saying, so the opposite of a fact is a lie. Okay? Then she says that neither Plato nor Hobbes were concerned with organized lying on the part of the state, in other words, propaganda, and we don't really know why that is. But historically, they did make a distinction between the life of the philosopher on one hand and the life of the citizen or of politics on the other. So remember in Plato's allegory of the cave, the citizens are chained in the cave looking at the shadows on the wall, and the philosopher is the one that goes outside and looks at the sun. And remember also how we said that for ancient philosophers like Plato, they were always concerned with discovering the essential nature of things. We talked about this last week or the week before. The whole point of philosophy was to discover what is the essential nature of humanity, or what is the essential nature of God, what is the essential nature of truth or beauty or anything. Plato called these the forms, with like a capital F, forms. There's the pencil, and then there's the idea or ideal of the pencil that exists only in my head, right? That's what ancient philosophers were always concerned with, this essential nature, which is always eternal and unchanging. So that's why they say that the opposite of that is opinion, which is always changing. And that opinion is what dominates political life. So here we have the opposite to truth being opinion, right? Now, she says on page 298, which is page 4 of the PDF, and this begins a bit of a difficult section of the article, so hang in there. What she's talking about in this section is the role of other people or community in the reasoning process. And this is the part where, if you don't get all the details here, it's fine. Kant said that we need other people in order to be able to think. Other philosophers had slightly different takes on this, but they were all addressing, what is the role of other people? Can human beings actually think on their own, or do we need other people in order to think? And especially there's this one idea where she talks about Madison. She's referring to James Madison there. That it becomes or is a founding idea of liberalism. And that is the idea that if more people agree on something, does that make it more true? The idea is that the thinking of the community, any one individual can err or make an error, but the community as a whole, if we take all of their logic together, we're more likely to get a right answer, right? So that's the idea. This is on page 299, bottom, or page 5 of the PDF, okay? So it's a bit of a, not quite a tangent there, but she's, it's okay if you don't get all the details in that section. The main takeaway, though, is that people were thinking about how best to arrive at or discern the truth. Is it by thinking on our own, or is it by thinking within a community? Okay? So now she says, think about what that means. That means the locus of truth has shifted with that idea that we think better in community with others. That idea means that the locus of truth has shifted from man in the singular, to use her weird gendered language, to men in the plural. And that's a significant shift, she says. That's why things have changed in our own time. Look again at the bottom of page 299, the top of page 300, the top of page 5 of the PDF. And she says again, so it's not religious or philosophical truths that interfere in political life, but factual truths, which does so. She's reiterating that same point, that philosophy, as the realm of truth, is no longer threatening to the powers that be. Facts are. She says, even in Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia, it was more dangerous to talk about the concentration camps or the Gulag, and whose existence was no secret, than it was to hold and utter heretical views on the ideology, the official ideology of the state. Remember in the previous paragraph, she had said ideologies, we could consider them to have taken the place of philosophy, and that would be not really. But even if you do that, it still doesn't change the fact that totalitarian regimes don't find differences or disputes with ideology as threatening as they do find somebody talking about a fact. Okay? So if a factual truth upsets a lot of people, then it gets attacked and treated as if it were opinion, right? That's what she's claiming in this article. And I'm sure we've all had a similar experience where somebody says, you state a fact and the other person says, well, that's just your opinion. Right, that's what she's talking about. So then she says, like, take this, going back to that analogy of, Plato's cave, she says, now it's not the philosopher who is being threatening to the powers that be. It's the fact teller. And the fact teller is actually worse off than the philosopher, because at least the philosopher went out into another realm and came back, and they can console themselves with that, well, I have been to this other realm of reality, and that's why people in this realm don't understand me. The fact teller doesn't have that consolation. They are staying within the realm of the cave where humanity lives and politics happens, and they're trying to assert the facts. And so that's why it's so disorienting when people dispute that and don't want to believe in the facts. So like I said, this was a bit of a difficult section. I tried to summarize it as best I could. Get through it the best you can and go on. In the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that social nature, because the social nature of the political realm, which is the realm of facts, and she says also the realm of opinion. Okay, so hope this is helpful. Okay, so the key to understanding section 3 is to look again at the very first sentence of that section. She says, all truths are opposed to opinion in their mode of asserting validity. So what does that mean? That's what she's going to talk about in this section. So she'll explain by the end of this section, but how does a truth assert its validity? Like, in other words, how do we know that it's true? That's the question, okay? So she starts out by saying that truth has this despotic character. That's why it's hated by tyrants. You can't wish it away, she said on page 303, which is page 9 of the PDF. Even Hugo Grotius said, even God cannot make 2 + 2 not equal 4. And that's not a statement on the limited power of God. That's a statement about the power of the logic of 2 + 2 = 4. So Arendt says no matter how powerful the tyrant is, and it doesn't matter how many people agree or disagree with something, factual truth, just like rational truth, is still what it is. It's not changed by political opposition. It's not challenged by opinion. And that leads to a problem, because opinion is what makes up public life. So political thought, she says, is representative. She talks about this on page 303. And by that she means when we're acting in public as part of the political community, we have to take up standpoints or representations of different people other than ourselves in order to think communally, to think about how we are going to how to make decisions about how to live together, right? So the more you can do this, the more you can take up the representations of other people, then the stronger your representative thinking will be, and thus the more valid your opinion, okay? But opinion is not self-evident, she says. It has to be arrived at discursively. Rationality might be linear, but opinion is discursive, meaning it meanders and it's influenced by others. It's a social process. So the means by which we arrive at valid opinion in political life is a social process influenced by others. And she says that social process is very opaque. So it's not transparent, right? This is page 304 of the article. I think it's right at the top, which is page 10 of the PDF. And she says this explains why the coercive nature of truth is so frustrating. Because the coercive nature of factual truths is so frustrating because they are contingent. Factual truths are contingent. And by that, all she means is that a factual truth could always have been otherwise. So it's always possible. It's a conceivable, plausible thing that in August 1914, it was Belgium that invaded Germany rather than Germany that invaded Belgium. That's something plausible. Or, perhaps nobody invaded anybody in August 1914. That's also plausible. So when she says that factual truths are contingent, that's what she means. They always could have been otherwise. That when we look back in hindsight, they look like they're inevitable, but that's just an illusion. This is the result of humans having free will, basically, because we can always do whatever we want. Our free will results in the contingency of factual truths. That's the price of freedom, she says, right? And she says this is why it's easy to discredit factual truths, because just like opinions they're not self-evident. They always could have been otherwise. They're contingent. They always could have been otherwise, and they are not self-evident. We can't get there through, they are not a rational type of process, right? We can't get there through rationality. So that's why it's easy to discredit factual truth that you don't like as just another opinion. So she says this midway down page 304 of the article. So now the question is, what do we do? Should we try to persuade people of the truth? How do we do that? Even Socrates failed at that, right? What if you take political power and you impose the truth upon people? Well, okay, then you've got a tyranny. Even if a philosopher could get a monarch to listen to them, it would still be tyrannical to impose truth upon people. And she says, even if you could get everyone to voluntarily accept the truths, willingly, that really doesn't mean anything because tomorrow they could change their minds, right? You cannot impose truth upon people. They can only arrive at it on their own. So how does a philosopher prove the validity of their truth? And she says for the philosopher, they prove it by living it, by acting upon it. And this is what Socrates did. Socrates staked his life upon his truth, the teaching by example, right? But that form of persuasion is only open to philosophers. It doesn't make any sense for somebody to stake their life on the validity or veracity of a particular fact. So that option is kind of unavailable to the teller of factual truths. So section 3 ends on kind of a downer here. And actually, we're going to stop here for today as well, because sections 1 through 3 were the only sections that were due for Monday's class. The next class, we will pick up with sections 4 and 5. And it doesn't stay a downer. She does help us out of this conundrum that she has so clearly put us in now, but we're going to stop here from today because this video is also already like over half an hour long. All right, so hang in there and I'll see y'all in class. Okay, so she says that factual truth, on the contrary, is always related to other people, on the contrary, as opposed to rational truth, she means. Factual truth concerns events and circumstances in which many are involved, It's established by witnesses, and it depends upon testimony. It exists only to the extent that it is spoken about, even if it occurs within the domain of privacy. So it is political by nature, she writes. Facts and opinions belong to the same realm, meaning the realm of public or political affairs, the social world. What she's talking about here is that, in other words, what is at stake here is that common shared reality that creates the basis for social life. Remember at the very beginning of the semester, we read that article by Sophia Rosenfeld, and Sophia Rosenfeld called it public knowledge or serviceable truths. They're talking about the same thing here. We can argue about philosophy or religion or ideology, and we can all have different opinions about those things, but we cannot, or at least we should not, be arguing about facts, because facts form the very basis of the socio-political world. They are the ground beneath our feet, she says at the very end of the article. She says also that we can debate the ontological question. She doesn't use the word ontological, I just added it here. Ontological is the theory of what exists in the world. So she says we can debate that ontological question of whether facts exist at all outside of their interpretation. So like if nobody saw it, if nobody saw the tree fall in the forest, does it make a noise? That's, ontological question. She says we can debate that, but that doesn't change the fact that things happen. Okay? In August 1914, Germany did invade Belgium. And we can't have people saying, in August 1914, Belgium invaded Germany. Otherwise, the very ground beneath our feet is going to become unstable, and we'll have this blurring of the line between fact and opinion. Okay, so one more thing to tell you on the next slide, and then we're done with this section.